Hello, friends. My name is Sebastian Monses, and welcome to my review of the book The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. Obviously, I read this book for the sake of a class project. Over the summer, I was supposed to read a book rooted in the field of biology. When going down the list of books that I was allowed to read, I simply found the word immortal, and right away I was interested. When I think of the word immortal, I think of the impossible, and I wanted to know if immortality was actually possible in the real world. And to my fascination, it was. So the story begins not long after Henrietta Lacks has her fifth child. She begins to have pains throughout her body. Eventually, she decides to go to Johns Hopkins Medical Clinic nearby. It was 1951 at the time, so most black people didn't get much of the medical attention. Luckily, Henrietta was able to go in, but the doctors didn't say it was that bad when they first saw her. After a while, she came back, and it was much worse. It turns out that it was cervical cancer. During 1951, the doctors thought that the element radium was capable of curing that cancer. Before they administered the treatment, the doctor George Guy was able to obtain a sample of her cervical cancer. George Guy was a man on a mission. His life's work is to create the world's first immortal human cells. For every cell that he was able to get a hold of, Guy gave them a name based on the patient's first two letters of their first and last name. For Henrietta Lacks, it was called Gila. Then placed these cells into a solution that he made and incubated them. For most of the cells that he did this with, it ended up dying about 24 hours later. However, Gila was different. Gila actually doubled in size every 24 hours. Eventually, he ended up with so many cells that he needed to find ways to store them and to find people to give them to. A couple factories were even made specifically to do this. These cells were able to incredibly change the entirety of the biology field once they were so widespread, and it still is. Not long after they were first discovered, Gila was used to tackle the polio pandemic. For this, Gila was used as a test subject in place of real human beings, and since Gila grew at a much faster rate than normal human cells, results were seen a lot faster. Since then, the same idea has been used for every virus vaccine afterwards, including the HIV virus and now the COVID-19 viruses. But that wasn't the only things that these cells did. At one point, George had a realization. Science requires accurate results. And he realized that scientists at the time were actually using different equipment and procedures to handle Gila. It took some time, but eventually he was able to convince the people using his cells to use the same cell solution, materials, and methods in order to use these cells, which eventually evolved into a standardized, universal set of lab materials and procedures. And that's not all. Using Gila, science started to realize what human cells actually were. Using these cells and a couple others, it was discovered that human cells actually contained 46 chromosomes instead of 48, which is what they originally thought at the time. This led to the explanation of several chromosome-based diseases like Down syndrome. Also, using these cells, a discovery was made on how people could properly keep them. Gila grew so extremely fast that it was discovered that freezing them is able to stop the growth process, and once it was thawed out, it goes right back to growing like normal. For Gila, people made freezers specifically designed for cells, and any other sensitive materials that might need it. Later on, Gila was even able to test several aspects of the world, such as the effect of radiation, drugs of all kinds, and even beauty products. However, Gila wasn't perfect. Well, actually, Gila was extremely powerful, but that was the problem. Gila was so powerful that it actually was able to overpower any other cell line that it was introduced with. Some scientists tried to use Gila to see how the human body affects cancer. They did experiments on people without telling them, and placed Gila into their bodies. Scientists learned that Gila was slightly different from other cancers, but the word got out about this, and several people got in trouble. This eventually led to the mandatory need for patient consent and required scientists to give a full story about what they're doing to their patients. Not only that, but Gila also caused several copyright problems. Other than Henrietta Lacks, several people had parts of their bodies donated to science, and the courts stated that people could not claim copyright on their bodies once it had already been donated to science. The examples that they used is that the Lacks family didn't claim copyright on Henrietta's cells. This brings us back to the Lacks family, and how they dealt with their lives after Henrietta's gone. So, after Henrietta died, her husband David, or as he is normally called, Day, got a phone call from George that he wanted to do an autopsy on Henrietta. Day limited him to only a partial one, but George never told him about what he did to Henrietta's cell sample. Day didn't even know that he even took a cell sample in the first place. With Henrietta gone, her kids ended up being raised extremely poorly. One of her children, Joe, who later renamed himself as Zachariah, was constantly being whipped at a young age by the person who ended up taking care of him. Her daughter Deborah was constantly being raped, and her youngest daughter Elsie was given to a black mental hospital where she was experimented on and practically tortured to death. Eventually, in 1973, the word finally got out to the Lacks family about what happened to Henrietta's cancer cells. Learning about this created a wide variety of emotions for them, and specifically led them to a strong hatred for the Johns Hopkins Medical Clinic. However, Deborah wanted to learn more about her mother's cells and started to do research into her mother, getting a hold of several biology textbooks where she eventually sees the very first picture of her mother that she ever saw. Eventually, some people contacted the Lacks family and wanted to give them some recognition for what Henrietta did. It seemed like Henrietta was finally getting some recognition for what she did after such a long time, after being known only as Gila. However, that didn't last long. Eventually, a conman showed up and was able to trick everyone who was involved in Henrietta's fame. This caused several Henrietta-based plans to be cancelled, and caused the Lacks family to be closed off from trusting people ever again. Or, at least, that was until the writer of this book, Rebecca Skloot, came along to interview them about Gila. At first, the family was skeptical of her, considering what happened to him in the past, but soon they were able to warm up to her and allowed her to write the book. She was even able to become best friends with Deborah, and the two of them were able to conduct research together on her. And this is where some of my favorite parts of this book come from. Occasionally, Deborah would still be skeptical of Rebecca. Every once in a while, she would lash out at Rebecca, thinking that she was actually an agent for Johns Hopkins Medical Clinic. After a little bit of argument, Deborah went back to being Rebecca's best friend, like those arguments never even happened. However, my actual favorite scene in this book was when Rebecca first introduced Deborah to the internet. When she learned about it, Deborah spent long nights looking up about Henrietta and Gila. What I found interesting was that Deborah found the Marvel villain Gila, and later the Norse god Hel that the character was based on. What's interesting is the information about Hel. Hel is the Norse goddess of death and governs over the underworld, not in an evil way like some other underworld gods are. Hel's appearance is that of a beautiful young woman for her upper body, and that of a rotting corpse for her lower. Why I like this is that after Deborah read that, it reminded her of her own mother, and in a way, it was actually quite similar to what Henrietta is. After all of the things that Rebecca did for that family, they were finally able to get closure for what happened to Henrietta and what happened to them in their lives. Sadly, several members of the Lax family ended up dying after Rebecca finished reporting on Henrietta. This includes Deborah. But now some of the funds that are being made from this book actually go back to the existing Lax family so that they can actually get good educations for the future. So what I learned from this book is actually more of a accurate mental picture of the field of biology and what times everything happened. It is incredibly surprising to me that all of these innovations happened so recently. Things like the specific number of chromosomes in humans and universal standardized labware were actually uncovered much more recently than I thought. I also learned a lot about how bad the medical field was before the 1950s. Doctors commonly got the diagnoses wrong at the time, and toxic things like radium were actually believed to be healthy at the time when it actually made things worse. With all this said, I really like the book. If you're someone who wants to learn facts but thinks doing so is potentially boring, this book is great. This book is written in such a way that it keeps your interest and even adds some humor and emotional moments while still keeping a completely true story in it. So at the end of it, I say that the story of Henrietta Lacks is a great story filled with several twists and turns that leaves most of the people involved in the story actually pretty satisfied, including me. And, uh, that's the end of my script.